What do we know about the goddess Bridget? Well, Dagda agus Fáilte. Hi, hello, and welcome to Jon O'Sullivan from the Irish Pagan School. And we know quite a bit about the goddess Bridget, but some of the content and some of the stories is a little bit blurred with the latter manifestation of Saint Bridget within Irish culture and spirituality. Now, I'm not going to dive into Goddess Bridget, or well, I'm not going to dive into Saint Bridget because that would be crossing and blurring lines. I want to say clearly that I'm going to try and give as much info as I can, or at least some insight onto the Goddess Bridget. So, the Goddess Bridget is one of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Tuatha Dé Danann are the second to last tribe to come into Ireland at the end of the mythological cycle of Ireland's lore. And the Tuatha Dé Danann are descended from Irenbale the Soothsayer, son of Nemed, and having gone out of Ireland when the Numidians were under oppression, their descendants later come back into Ireland as the Tuatha Dé Danann. And amongst the Tuatha Dé Danann is a very prominent and very powerful figure known as the Dagda. Now, how does the Dagda list link to Bridget, Goddess Bridget? Well, Goddess Bridget's his daughter, very clearly stated. When we come across references and information in a number of different locations, it is Bridget, daughter of the Dagda, is put in. Now, lineage is pretty important. Like, who you're descended from, who your like parental line and lineage is going back was pretty important culturally speaking, right down into the medieval period, actually, in Irish culture. We know that at an Éineach, which was a gathering declared by a king, the people who had their lineages declared and set forth by a bard would have the right to speak at the gathering of the king. So lineage is pretty important. So the fact that we have Bridget being called the daughter of the Dagda sets her very squarely within a certain echelon of the Irish gods. The follow-up question that we get hit with quite common is, who was Bridget's mother? We don't know. There is no record in the lore. There's no specific declaration in the information. Like, we have a number of different deities with their own lineages, and sometimes we get mother and father, sometimes we get one or the other. So it's not uncommon that we wouldn't know all of the lineage of every single deity. But because of the prominence of Bridget and the popularity of belief and work with Bridget, a lot of people are like, well, who's her mother though? And officially, we can't say for sure who is her mother. I have my own thoughts on that, but I've done another video about that elsewhere. Now, Bridget's pretty important, like in her own right, regardless of her connection and lineage to her father, Dagda, who is the good god of Druidry, according to the Tuatha Dé Danann. Bridget herself is listed in a book known as Cormac's Glossary, which is one of the other manuscripts that we have. It's a ninth century manuscript written down by the Christian monks. So, but the ninth century makes it one of the older manuscripts that we can talk about, like the Great Book of Lecan, Yellow Book of Lecan, Book of Kells, Book of Fermoy, all of these various manuscripts we can date via the linguistics or via, like, the scientific carbon dating of the history or the history within the tome itself. But when we talk about ninth century is some of the oldest works that we physically have records of now. And so the fact that Cormac's Glossary goes right the way back to the oldest sources that we can point at means that the content in there is treated very seriously, because it's less likely to have been written over or rewritten or changed or influenced during the medieval cycle of the later 11th, 12th, 14th century. So in Cormac's Glossary from the ninth century, it lists out Bridget and says Bridget was the goddess to whom poets adored. So poets specifically gave worship or adoration towards Goddess Bridget. It also says that she's listed as having two sisters, also Bridget the healer and Bridget the smith. Now, whether or not there are three separate daughters of the Dagda, all called Bridget, one a poet, one a healer, and one a smith, I don't personally think so. I think it's the various aspects of Bridget and my approach and my experience as a pagan working and worshipping Irish deities, particularly the Dagda. But she is listed in these three facets, shall we say, of influence, which is the poetry, healing, and smithcraft. So anyone coming and working with Bridget or approaching their spirituality to connect with Bridget could connect through any of these processes. It's not just, oh, she's a woman's goddess for woman's work. She's a smith goddess. Like she absolutely is in the fire at the forges, tempering out and hammering stuff upon the anvil. I have had the honor of working with and knowing many Bridget people in my time, and yeah, their processes of spiritual practice and spiritual work with Bridget sometimes has them put in the fires to burn away what doesn't serve them, and then placed upon the anvil and hammered to temper them and make them ready for their next challenge. But I do know other people who work with Bridget in the healing aspect or do dedicate their poetry towards Bridget. So there are many different ways to connect with this Irish goddess. And that's quite common, actually. In other pantheons, you may have a god who is the god of X, and that's it. Within the Irish pantheon, it's less likely there is a single god of war, a single god of battle, single god of, well, war and battle, a single god of love, or a single god of harvest. You know, pretty much this expression of multifaceted deity is quite common amongst the Irish gods. Um, some other important pieces of note during the Leabhar Gabhála Éireann, when it talks about the Tuatha Dé Danann returning into Ireland, Bridget is there. Bridget is there at that time because after the first Battle of Moytura, when Nuada has his arm cut off, before he has his silver arm prosthesis installed, which is where he gets the epithet Argetlov or silver armed, um, when he's deposed as king, the king who replaces him is someone known as Bres. And Bres is not the greatest king, I'll be honest. He's half Fomorian, half Tuatha Dé Danann, and he puts his Tuatha Dé Danann tribe under oppression pretty much in favor of his Fomorian ancestry. But we know that Bridget, the daughter of the Dagda, is wed to Bres. And so in his role as king in Ireland, this adds almost a sovereignty aspect to Bridget and Bridget's purpose because we know, culturally speaking, kings in Ireland needed to be wed to a goddess of sovereignty in order to ensure balance between our world and the other world. So does this make Bridget sovereignty goddess or not? Hard to say for sure, but it's not too much of a reach given what we know of the lore and of the information. So Bridget is wed to Bres, and not just wed to Bres, she also bears Bres a son by the name of Ruadán. And so Ruadán grows up like, yeah, he grows up like, to full adulthood during the rule, excuse me, during the rule of Bres, because we know this for sure, because by the time we get to the second Battle of Moytura, which is where Bres becomes deposed and is cast out of Ireland, he rallies a Fomorian army for invasion. Ruadán is a grown person at this point. He goes to Gwivnu, who is the chief smithing god of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and he pleads with Gwivnu to give him a spear. Now, Gwivnu doesn't just make spears, he makes the best of spears. It's said of Gwivnu that any wound carried from a spear made by Gwivnu was a mortal wound. And mortal wounds were your pretty much game over wounds. Now, Ruadán pleads and pleads. Initially, Gwivnu's like, no, you can't have a spear. So he's still obviously young, but he's not so young that eventually Gwivnu does relent and he makes a spear for Ruadán. Now, Ruadán, favoring his father, decides that if he takes it upon himself to slay the chief smith of the Tuatha Dé Danann, he can ensure the Fomorian invasion and victory. So when Ruadán receives the spear from Gwivnu, he turns around and tries to kill Gwivnu with it. Now, interestingly, the spear that every wound from the spear is a mortal wound, guaranteed. Anyone who takes a wound from the spear, it's game over. Ruadán stabs Gwivnu with the spear. Gwivnu takes the spear out of himself and uses the same spear to stab Ruadán. Gwivnu lives, Ruadán dies. Interestingly, Gwivnu, with his ability to make mortal wounds from these weapons, apparently doesn't suffer mortal wounds from these weapons, which seems rather smart as far as the Gwivnu story go. But Ruadán is slain, and this is where the grief of Ruadán's demise leads to back to Bridget, and Bridget wails and cries and mourns for Ruadán. And it is said that the first keening ever heard in Ireland was performed by Bridget because of this loss, because of this grief. Now, that's pretty important because all the way down, even Actually, only a generation or so before I was born did the keening practice kind of die out here in Ireland. Keening was a performative expression of grief based on not just an individual who has suffered the grief, but the community who has suffered the grief. There were professional keeners in Ireland, people who would wail and scream and cry at funerals in order to carry the grief for the community and allow it to be expressed when some other people within the community may not be able to express their grief. So the fact that keening, this core practice and very culturally significant practice to Irish people, was first created by a goddess, and not any goddess, but this goddess of healing, poetry, and metalwork or smithcraft, Bridget, is a very interesting facet and interesting thing to know about Bridget. There's a couple other things to know. Her being Daddy's daughter, maybe, I don't know. He does look after his children very well, the Dagda. But during the Lair Gavala Éireann, it does say that there's a number of different domestic animals that are linked with Bridget. She has two oxen. She has the king of all boars, apparently, and she also has, oh, what's it called? She has some other creature as well, and we know this because the Dinhenicus, the lore of names and places, tells us that the name of certain mountains or the name of certain plains or river plains are named the way they are because they were the beasts that Brigid actually had. I think it's the plain of the River Barrow and the plain of the River Suir are named after her two oxen. And that's why we know that it is her who has those creatures. So it's not just a case of her being only linked with healing, poetry, or smithcraft. There is also this domestic aspect to it, as well as the sovereign domestic animal aspect, as well as the sovereignty aspect there involved too. So, Bridget's a very culturally significant goddess, and there are many different ways to approach a relationship with Bridget and to explore it. But the best way when dealing with any kind of deity is to start by learning their stories first. Start by learning the information about them so that as you approach, or if you're choosing to approach a spiritual connection with God's guides, guardians, you're doing it from an informed point of view. You're doing it from an aware point of view so you can be respectful of who and how they are in themselves, not what you want of them. So at this time of year, again, there's no direct link or relationship between Goddess Bridget and Imbolc, but there is relationships between Saint Bridget and Imbolc because many people celebrate Imbolc on 1st of February, which is Saint Bridget's Day in Ireland. Now, there are links again between Saint Bridget and Goddess Bridget or Goddess Bridge. So it is steps and steps and steps, but as much as we wanted to have a conversation, or I wanted to have a conversation here about Goddess Bridget, that's why I'm not chaining that in and getting pulled over into the St. Bridget side of it. We have a lot of content on the Irish Pagan School about Bridget, taught by another native Irish teacher, Orla Costello, who is a Bridget dedicant for Goddess and Saint. And so I would recommend them as a resource to look up and to explore if you were pursuing information about Bridget. So classes on the Irish Pagan School, as I said, I'll probably pull a link out and put that down below. And if you're not looking for Bridget content and you're looking for something else, we might have that too. All you got to do is go to irishpagan.school/free. There's a year's worth of free resources there. And when you're ready to dive deeper, we have, paid classes on a number of different topics like, oh yeah, nearly 200 I think we're at the moment. Yeah, we have a lot of courses available to allow you to improve your education, explore the lore, get to know the information, which means that as you take the steps to experience your spiritual relationship, you're doing it from an informed and an empowered position. So as ever, thank you very much for stopping by. Gaurav Mila Mahagat, and until next time, look after yourself. Agus Salán. Goodbye.